and good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call the special City Council meeting, special for October the 18th, 2021, which is starting at 5 o'clock. Call the meeting to order, and if we could ask our city clerk for roll call, please.
Councilmember Hamilton?
Here.
Councilmember Mason is not yet in the room. Councilmember Salazar?
Here.
Vice Mayor Marty Medina?
Here.
Mayor Rico Medina?
Here. Now we'll move on to item 3, public comments for items not on the agenda. Individuals will have up to 3 minutes to discuss items that are not on the agenda. And this evening on the agenda is receiving about SB 35 and as well as measures 9 and 10 that were passed in Sacramento. So if there's anyone who wishes to speak on items other than those, if they could raise their hand at this time, and we will bring you into the room. Seeing no hands, we will go ahead and move on to the special meeting portion of the agenda. And we will receive a report regarding the recently adopted new housing laws. And we will first turn that over to our city manager for some opening remarks, and then he can pass it off on to our community development director. City manager.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council and the public. Javon Grogan, your city manager. For our special meeting this afternoon, there are 2 topics, and both of them relate to housing. The first, we will discuss newly enacted state laws with respect to housing, and these laws in particular aim to reduce local control. And that's an important concept, and the key provisions of these laws, as we'll see in the second item, really limit our ability to decide on what housing is developed here in San Bruno and impact that through our local rules, be that our zoning ordinance, our transit corridors plan, or any other specific plan. And so the first presentation on housing laws is really done as a precursor to our next item, which is a project that we have, application that we have received for a SB 35 project. It's important to note that the conversations and presentation tonight on that project is not a hearing on the project. It is simply a mechanism to provide information to the city council as well as the community. We're going to begin tonight with a presentation from our Community and Economic Development Director, Pamela Wu. After that presentation, both Pamela, myself, and the city attorney are here and available to the city council to answer any questions or clarify anything in the presentation. After that, we will go to item 4B, which is again a presentation on a development application for a housing project that we have received. And so now I'll turn it over to our Economic and Development Director, Pamela Wu.
And Director Wu, just as you're coming to the podium, colleagues, if we could let Director Wu go through their presentation and hold questions to the end, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Director?
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon. Thank you, City Manager. So as the City Manager mentioned, today we're going to be talking about some of the recently adopted new housing laws. And as we're migrating to the first slide, the objective, again, is really to provide an overview of these state legislations and also how it's impacting the local jurisdiction on our policies, regulations, and limit the city's ability to influence these housing projects. The agenda for tonight, we'll start with the objective, as I stated earlier, and then we'll go back to how we got to where we are today, the background. Then we'll select some of the highlighted recently adopted housing laws, such as SB 9, SB 10, the Ancestry Dwelling Unit Ordinance, SB 35, Housing Accountability Act, such as HA 8, SB 330, and end it with the state density bonus law. And of course, I'll conclude my presentation with questions from Mayor and City Council. So a little bit about background. Development in the city of San Bruno, just like any other cities in California, is governed primarily by local zoning use rules and regulation, and these are stipulated in our general plan, in a zoning ordinance, or in this voter approval initiative. And the attempt is to strike a balance between the new development and existing development, and also to maintain that quality of life for business and residents for all. These regulations have been adopted by City Council, in some cases, Planning Commission and Architectural Review that have provided a recommendation that consider environmental review, the placement, the location, height, design, parking, among other features. What most of these actions are commonly referred to as a discretionary review application, where a project will go through Architectural Review Committee for consideration and then go to Planning Commission for a second recommendation, where City Council may have the final say, as opposed to a project that goes through a building permit review is what we commonly refer to as a ministerial review. In the recent years, the state of California has enacted new housing laws that superseded local use and land use regulations. Some of these new state laws are designed to streamline the review and approval of development application in an effort to increase the production of both affordable and market rate units. The new state law has also restricted this discretionary review by limiting the applicability of local zoning regulation, including those approved by a vote of people. Such area could be height, number of stories, the amount of density, or parking requirement. Other laws have implemented provisions to expedite and streamline review process, and also waive certain requirements through a density bonus request. These laws have changed how local jurisdiction review development project and fundamentally provide a certainty for developers who are searching or seeking for housing approvals in the cities of California. Let's start with some of the housing laws that have recently got enacted and some of the highlights. We'll start with SB Senate Bill 9, SB 9. So this was one of the recent laws that was signed into effect by Governor Newsom on September 19th. The effective date of this law will take place January 1st, 2022. In a nutshell, this law will allow single-family residential lots to be split up to have a total of 4 units from the original 1. It will prohibit any discretionary review and only require ministerial reviews through a building permit should the homeowner want to split their lots up to construct additional units. The criteria is that they will have to meet objective design standard. It would also allow the R1 lots to be splitted up, each at a 1,200 square feet minimum, with a 2-unit or duplex constructed on the original lot. Simple math puts you from 1 existing house to up to 4 units if the homeowner desires to go through this exercise. SB 9 will also preempt zoning standard to have new units at a minimum of 800 square feet. For some reason, if the setbacks or height limits the unit to be smaller, per the local land use regulation, state law will supersede that regulation. It would also prohibit any parking requirement to be no more than 1 space per unit. Our local regulation right now requires each single-family house to provide 2 off-street parking spaces. However, the state does require and encourage these new units to be compatible with existing neighborhood homes. They want to make sure that the neighborhood is still designed and constructed in a cohesive manner. This is an illustration for the SB 9. The picture on the left-hand side shows you the existing neighborhood with single-family homes, where potentially your neighbors on the left and the right wants to split them up and also to put a duplex on each of the newly lots. And also the picture on the right also shows the fundamental characteristic of an existing R1 zoning district that potentially will be different after SB 9 takes place in January of 2022. However, it is worth noting that in consideration of the full effect of SB 9, there was a recent study that was done to look at the feasibility and also the benefit of constructing these additional units. It's worth noting that the ADUs in the city of San Bruno, ever since the new ADU law came into effect in 2020, we've seen a steady increase of the production of ADUs. We actually saw quite a bit of an increase that the study concluded no more than 500 units that might be constructed pursuant to SB 9. There's a more likelihood for homeowners to benefit and also exercise and utilize the ADU route than to build 4 units on a single lot. Another recent law that was sent into effect in September, which will take effect by next January, is SB 10. SB 10 allows a city but does not require the city to have up to a 10-unit apartment building in a single-family residential R1 district. Should the city council wants to enact an ordinance, council can direct staff to upzone a certain area to allow whether it's a discretionary or administrative or ministerial process for such upzoning to take place. SB 10 also allows such upzone exercise to be exempt from CEQA, that's California Environmental Quality Act, if the location of that project is what we call within a transit-rich area. In simple terms, a transit-rich is anywhere within half a mile to a transit stop. In the city of San Bruno, that would be El Camino, San Bruno Avenue, or half a mile from the Caltrain or the BART station. SB 10, as I mentioned, if city council or local jurisdiction elects to upzone, we could design the upzone exercise either to go through administrative, discretionary, or whatever CEQA analysis that's sufficient for such exercise. This picture shows the full effect, the possible potential full effect of a single family residential neighborhood on the left in comparison to a potential mix of single family homes with SB 9 being split up to 2 lots with 2 duplexes, and a potential of SB 10 being in effect where we allow upzoning of the R1 to a 10-unit apartment. So this again will change the traditional characteristic of a neighborhood from single family home only in R1 to a variety of different housing products. Let's talk about ancestry dwelling, the ADUs that were effective since 2020. Prior to that, an ADU in the city of San Bruno will have to go through discretionary review. They have to go through planning approval before they can submit for a building permit. Started in 2020, all of the accessory dwellings in San Bruno are subject to building permit. And earlier in 2021, City Council has also adopted the zoning code amendment to mirror what the state legislation to require no discretionary review for any junior ADUs and ADUs. ADUs can be up to 800 to 1,000 square feet. Detached units could be up to 16 feet height with 4 feet setback. And also, any homeowner who's interested in building an ADU can also benefit to have an additional junior ADU. In other words, any single family homes can have a detached ADU in your backyard in addition to a converted bedroom that turns into a junior ADU. That will be a total of 3 units for each of the residential lots. As I mentioned, the City of San Bruno has seen a steady increase of these ADU permits since 2020. We have received 43 building permits in year of 2020, and before concluding 2021, we have seen another 43 this year. Prior to the new laws being adopted, we're seeing an average of about 13 ADU permits in a year. Let's take a look at another state housing law that has been around for some time, which is known as the SB 35 legislation. So SB 35 provides the project that meets the objective planning standard to be reviewed ministerially without any discretionary. And for a project to qualify, The project must have a multi-family component, including more than 2 units. I'm sorry, I think it's 2 units. That's a typo, not 10 units, it's a 2 units. It must include affordable units, and also it has to comply with the applicable objective design standards per the state and also per the city. It was a state law that was enacted in 2017 that became effective in 2018. This only applies to those cities who have not produced enough housing units per their current RENA cycle, that is your regional housing needs assessment. In the city of San Bruno's case, we're currently obligated to provide a total of 1155 units. We felt short of meeting that goal where a developer can come in and says, hey, city, you have not provided enough, and therefore we would like to propose a SB 35 project. Further, if a project is claimed to be a SB 35 compliant, there is no parking requirement for the amount of units that has been proposed in a project, should the project is located within half a mile to any public transit. This wording is slightly different from we're just talking about transit rich, but essentially, if a project is located half a mile from El Camino, where we have multiple Samtrans bus lines, or half a mile from the Caltrans or BART or some Bruno Avenue, they're exempt to be providing any parking for any of the new units. In addition to the streamlining and the no discretionary review mandate, if a project is compliant with SB 35, there is state mandated review timeframe. The first clock starts at the time of submittal. The city must provide a consistency determination letter within 60 days if the project is less than 150 units. If the project is larger, greater than 150 units, then the city gets 90 days to provide that letter. Subsequent to that, if the project, again, is less than 150 days from the time of submittal, the city must determine if this project is SB 35 eligible or compliant and to approve or deny that project. If the project is greater than 150 units, then the city has 180 days to do so. These are state mandated timeline for any SB 35 compliant projects. Next, let's talk about Housing Accountability Act and also SB 330. Housing Accountability Act has been around again since 2017, but has been amended in 2021. And this has to do with affordable and market rates where you have more than 2 units. It also applies to mixed-use project, which 2/3 of the square footage is residential. Applies to emergency shelter, transitional, and supportive housing, as well as others. Since 2018, the Housing Accountability Act has significantly increased the ability for housing developer to secure an approval for development in California. Unfortunately, it also significantly limited the local jurisdiction's ability to disapprove a project unless the project are found to have an unavoidable impact on public health or safety. If the project complies again with all the applicable objective design standards listed in a general plan, zoning, or subdivision rules, the city cannot disapprove the project or reduce the density. The city must make written finding that there is a specific adverse impact upon the public health or safety, and that it cannot be mitigated. The city must make additional finding to disapprove or make infeasible a proposed housing project for a low and very low or moderate income, i.e. the affordable units, or an emergency shelter that is inconsistent with the objective standard. SB 330, which is one of the other newer housing laws, was signed into effect in 2019. Essentially, the chart on the bottom of the slide kind of tells you what SB 30 is about. It limits the jurisdiction's ability to disapprove if it meets the zoning or general plan requirement. It also freezes the application fee at the time of the application that was submitted. For instance, sometimes when an application is submitted, for instance, in our case, 2019, but our fee kicked up in 2020. By claiming SB 330, all of the development application fees will be frozen at the time of the application, meaning that any new master fee schedule will not be applicable. It would also limit the number of a public hearing once the project is deemed complete. I believe that number of hearing is 5. When the project is deemed complete, the city cannot have more than 5 public hearings. If so, then the project gets an automatic approval. The project also gives a streamlining process that requires a detailed outline of how a developer can ensure an approval provided by planning staff. It would also have other regulation and restriction on how a housing project is reviewed under SB 330. Let's talk a little bit about state density bonus. This allows, in a very simple term, a developer to exceed the maximum allowable density in a development. For instance, if the density for a particular project is at 20 units per acre, the density bonus law allows a developer to come in to increase that allowable density to a much greater, so long there are additional affordable units included in the project proposal. The amount of density bonus is set on a sliding scale depending on how affordable or how deep the affordability a project becomes. In addition to increased density, a density bonus law also allows a developer to request incentives or concessions for a project, a waiver or reduction of a redevelopment standard, and also qualify a developer from reduced parking ratio. You may want to ask, what are the differences between incentives, concession, waivers, and reduction of development standards? They all sound very much alike, in which they are. But per the state law, the incentives and concessions are possibly flexibility on meeting a setback to make the project financially feasible. Or a waiver or reduction of the development standard is where a developer can request a height exceedance or number of story to make the project physically feasible. There are clear definitions included in the state density bonus law, and the developer has the burden to clearly state which concessions and which waivers the project is seeking. That concludes my presentation for the state housing laws. I am here together with City Manager and also City Attorney Mark Zaccarano for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Director, and thank you for the presentation. We could stop sharing the screen when available. Thank you kindly. So what I'd like to do at this time, and again, keeping in mind that this topic is going over the various housing elements of the 9, 10 ADUs, 330, SB 35. So are there questions from my colleagues in regards to those topics for the presentation that was just seen? Seeing no hands, then, okay, Councilmember Hamilton?
I have a few questions.
Please.
So my first one, you actually answered during the presentation, which was how is close to transit defined. It looks like you can confirm for both SB 9 and SB 10. It's a much more rigorous, or a more rigorous definition of being in a transit-rich area than the ADU law was a lot more broad in terms of defining what's near transit. Is that correct?
Yes, so for both laws, they're defined as within half a mile to a public transit.
Okay, thank you. So are looking at SB 10 in the are our requirements that we currently have for lot coverage, are those part of the objective standards, or are those also overridden by this law?
I'll take it.
Sorry, does Councilmember Hamilton, I apologize, are you referring to SB 9 or SB 10?
Well, I guess it would apply to either, but I would think it would be more applicable for SB 10 if you're, for example, going to replace a single family home with a 10-unit apartment building. You might want to go, cover the entire lot with that, where, traditionally you wouldn't be able to cover an entire lot with a building in an R1 because there are rules for how much of the lot can be covered.
Sure. SB 10 actually allows the city to decide if we want to allow certain upzoning. So if city council decides that, hey, we want to keep our minimum lot coverage or to enforce our maximum lot coverage, and they would not be able to have a 10-unit apartment through SB 10.
Okay. All right, thank you for confirming that. And then my last question has to do with with SB 35 and the elimination of parking requirements. So tying the elimination of parking requirements with the proximity to public transit, obviously the intention is to have the new units occupied by residents who don't have cars. Is there any, well, actually, I might as well just confirm that that's likely the intention, correct? I want to make sure I'm not making a false assumption.
That is the intention, that since this is a transit-oriented development, any time that a project is located within a half a mile to a public transit.
Got it.
Yeah.
So given that, is there any requirement whatsoever that compels building owners to specifically try to attract those people, or even to disclose what the parking conditions are in the neighborhood to prospective tenants? And I ask this because I know, for example, with the when the Aperture building first opened and we were attracting tenants, and it was clear that there wasn't going to be enough parking, the prospective tenants in that building were told by the ownership, just go park in the neighborhood. So I'm just wondering if under these new laws, was there any provision whatsoever for at least having the disclosure of parking conditions for new residents?
Councilmember Hamilton, to our knowledge, no, there is no provision that requires that the property owner disclose to the new residents the parking conditions. What the law requires is that, subject to being in a transit-rich zone, parking does not have to be required. And the reasons for that are many. I watched a lot of the debate at the state legislature when they were talking about that. In many ways, I think people had different motives for that, but you're absolutely right in your prior question that there was both the thought that the units would be occupied by people that don't own cars, as well as the desire to, by building housing near transit and that housing not having parking, for people to maybe have a car, but eventually get rid of that car because there's not the parking. And so I think that the reasons for the state law, we shouldn't sort of say because I think legislators had many reasons for that. But what it says is that the parking does not have to be required, and we cannot require that parking.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Medina.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Just wanted to clarify that of SB 9, SB 10, SB 35, and SB 330, the one SB 10 is the only one where the council could really have much of a say in these different bills.
That is correct. So as it states right now, SB 10 gives the local jurisdiction an opportunity or a choice to implement.
And that's the only one that allows that. So I guess what I wanted to clarify for the public and from what I saw on social media, this isn't a city-led effort. These bills are from our state government, and they're being imposed on the city because the city isn't building enough housing. Would that be accurate?
Council member or Vice Mayor Medina, that's accurate, but I want to caveat the last point. It's not because the city is not building housing. We should be clear that as a city, we typically don't. Right.
That there's not enough built. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, and so when Director Wu mentioned our RENA numbers of 1,155, we have appropriately planned for that level of growth. That growth has not occurred because the housing has not been built. And so many of these laws, if not all of them, their sole intent was to increase housing production, and in many ways not to let other things be an impediment to building housing, parking being one of them, because we know parking is so expensive to incorporate within a project.
Understood. Thank you for that clarification. I would ask if staff could, on our city's website, put up maps that show where each of these bills apply, so that the major difference between SB 35 and SB 9 is are they both on transit on El Camino or all Samtrans stops? I wasn't really clear on one description of when they do apply, and if being so, that it would be shown on a map on our website that shows where all these bills apply. Would that be too difficult to do?
Here, Vice Mayor Medina, so the half-a-mile transit bridge or within public transit would apply to any transit that's on El Camino, San Bruno, as well as the Caltrans station and also the BART station.
Correct. And we'd be able to show that on a map on our website.
Vice Mayor, with regard to that, I think if we're able to do that, the best place to do that would be on our GeoCortex, our online GIS map. We'll have conversations with the staff that run that site to see, is there the ability to incorporate those maps that you're describing as a layer within the GIS system.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
And just for clarity, it was stated San Bruno, we're referencing San Bruno Avenue, and the Samtrans buses do count, even though some people have the belief that it means near the train station or BART. But just so people are clear that it's also qualifies for the Samtrans buses. Councilmember Mason.
Thank you. A couple of questions. Thank you for the presentation and for having this special meeting. I just wanted to start by asking if there's any requirements for under any of these laws for affordable or low-income housing. And just to be clear, is there any requirement that these developments must have or be affordable or low-income housing?
Yes, for SB 35 project, there has to be 20% of affordable, and for density bonus, depending on the affordability, they get greater flexibility. So yes, there's always an affordable housing component, not with SB 9.
Okay. And SB 10?
Not with SB 10. SB 10 just gives the city an opportunity to upsell.
So under these new rules, can individuals who currently have approved permits that are in the middle of construction, starting construction, can they go back to the city and then change their plans? And at what point can they do that?
I believe that they can always go back, forego their current construction, reapply through the current law that's in effect.
Okay, and then I noticed that one of the slides said that you can increase the fees, it sounds like. So would they pay a new fee for a new project, or would they essentially, would it be considered an active project with the city that's being somehow changed?
So if a project is under construction right now and they change their mind, they want to come back and also claim an SB 330, and you have to qualify for certain criteria to be an SB 330 project. And if they do qualify, yes, they will be entitled to the fee at the time when they apply. And then all the subsequent fees are frozen from the time of the new the new submittal.
Gotcha. Okay. Is there any forecasts by cities on how these laws will improve the housing situation? For example, for San Bruno, do we have any forecasting of how we'll meet our RENA requirements or what the increase will be of housing because of these new laws?
I don't know if there are any laws pertaining to SB 35 or density bonus or other sorts, but there is a feasibility that was conducted for the SB 9. This study by the Turner Center estimated about 500 units that will occur in the city of San Bruno in the next 10 to 20 years, should the homeowners want to pursue after the SB 9 option.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you. And then I hear you around the parking, and I think the parking is probably the biggest complaint, even pre these laws. It's been the biggest complaint I've heard about, even before being a council member. So I'm curious to know, can cities provide incentives to developers to provide additional parking? So it's clear that you can't require the additional parking. It's clear that they don't have to fulfill our local rules. Can the city provide incentives to encourage developers to provide additional parking?
Councilmember Mason, that's a question that is actually hard to answer given the nature of how these development projects come about. Oftentimes, we're talking about private property. Most of the time, we're talking about private property. Someone has either purchased the property in a transaction that the city is not a part of, or negotiated a contract with the owner of the property, and then comes and files an application. And so when that happens, in the case of the project we'll be talking about next, the applicant is using state law that essentially provides a streamlined path for the approval. There may be an opportunity to negotiate concessions. The challenge with that is timing. If the application is compliant with state law, they may not have to negotiate a reduction in parking. And so it's really something that has to, or negotiate a change in parking, in this case, an increase in parking. And so it's really something that has to be done on a case-by-case basis, because the real question in any negotiation is, what does one party have to offer the other? And so is there a blanket incentive that cities can provide to have developers provide more parking? I think that is I hesitate to say no, but I think that's a very hard thing to do, because developers are using powers granted to them that supersede our local regulations that provide a streamlined path for housing to be authorized and then to proceed straight to building permit. And so in that transaction, we really have to have something to offer. And with the cost of parking, when you're talking about subterranean, upwards of over $100,000 per space, or if you're talking about above ground, sometimes it's $60,000 or more, but it's taking away other developable land because there's a height cap, right? And so it's a very complicated issue that really is almost a property by property negotiation, if it's even possible.
Is it something we can, I guess, explore a little bit further? I mean, just really the issue is really, is it prohibited? And if not, maybe it's something that might be worth looking into, that could help the city with the parking to balance out the need for housing, right? Because we all know that we need housing. So My other question is around just infrastructure. For one of the other complaints you get is, as a council member, I would say, is you're building housing and we need infrastructure improvements. Would these projects, because depending on which bill we're talking about, they're different varieties, right? They're smaller. Sounds like smaller duplexes all the way up to the SB 35 project that we have tonight. At what point is the developer responsible for maintaining, not just maintaining, but really putting in new infrastructure under the development or under the lot?
Sure. So under all of the state laws that we reviewed tonight, developers are responsible for paying all the normal and customary fees. That includes our development impact fees, as well as any service connection fees that any other developer would have to provide, whether they're taking advantage of the new state legislation or not. And so those fees are paid. What the law requires is that those fees can't be increased after the application has been received.
But who's actually doing the work? So let's say you need to replace the underground infrastructure. I would imagine that that's not going to be required for a duplex, but it would likely be required for 125 units. I don't know. I mean, that's just a guess based on what I've seen. But at what point is that decision made, and do these laws impact that responsibility on the developer?
Yes. So, Councilmember Mason, the law does not impact the responsibility to pay the fees. With respect to who does the work, oftentimes it is the city, but there are other times where it is a negotiation with a specific application. You may remember a project that was required to pay the cost to upsize our water utility to serve their project. In cases like that, they are required to pay the fee, and we will work with the developer, and the developer may do the work subject to city review and approval. And so it's really a project by project situation, but most of the time, the developer is paying the fee and the city is putting in the infrastructure.
And with the increased fees, do you think that it's going to balance each other out? The city won't be paying extra or more than the actual cost of the replacement?
Speaking at a high level, that's exactly why we do fee studies and nexus studies, right? When we implemented our development impact fees, there was an analysis for what infrastructure the city would need from now until, I believe, 2040. There were growth factors on the cost escalation, and that was all factored into the fee model. And so the fee model captures the full cost of the improvement, actually includes a plan for that improvement being later. And our fee study has the ability for the city to increase the fees by an index every year. And so based on doing those fee studies and those nexus studies, the engineering exercise that you're going through when you set your fee is so that the fee amount covers the cost of providing the infrastructure. And you may remember that our development impact fees oftentimes do not cover all of the new infrastructure the city needs. It is only development paying their fair share of that new infrastructure that would be needed.
Okay. Okay, very helpful. Thank you.
Couple things on the development fees. That's why we established that, and then had how it can increase annually as we have master fee schedules, as we have had the staffing element looked at, right? So that our staff that is actually going out there and doing that, those costs are going on to the developer, so that we are being reimbursed, not maybe 100%, but certainly much better than it ever had been before. On SB 35, when it comes to projects, there's one that was noted on the agenda, but when it comes to prevailing wage to a project like that, my understanding is, and I just wanted more clarity, that prevailing wage is something that is met by a project as such, that it has to be payroll and other records documents must be maintained and be are available for review. Is that correct? Or not?
So, Mayor Medina, your question in large measure is, what are the wage requirements? Are there any wage requirements in the housing laws? And you mentioned SB 35. We can't answer that question right now, and do not want to give a off-the-cuff answer, but we will research that question and provide an answer to council with regard to, does SB 35 provide any requirements for payment of prevailing wage for construction, I believe is what the question is.
You're correct. For the contractors, subcontractors, I believe what I've understood or have heard, but I just wanted to clarify that for the those projects, because obviously they're streamlined, so there's very little time in which to go through that process. So I thought that there was stipulated in the SB 35 legislation that accounted for that. But I understand. Thank you for your response. At this time, not seeing any more hands up, I wanted to see if there were any members of the public that had questions. And I certainly want to thank everybody for being here, and certainly give anybody the opportunity. If you could please raise your virtual hand, it would be appreciated. And we'll see how many speakers we have. I'm seeing 4, 5, and then based on the number, we'll go with the time and then stop that. So currently I see 5 speakers. And so at this point, we will have 5 speakers. Each will have 3 minutes. And here are the 5 speakers. And City Clerk, if you could assist by starting with the first.
First is Paul Wapensky.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Thanks. First off, I'm still confused on the transportation-rich zone. Does that mean any bus stop? So like the bus stop that's on Keynes Avenue, can it be a half mile from that one bus stop, or does it have to be on El Camino?
Continue, and then I'll write it down and we'll get those answers for you.
All right. The second thing is on the parking issue. Well, first off, on SB 35, I thought this was a bad law when it was written and passed, and it even stinks higher now. But this parking thing is going to be really untenable. I don't think any reasonable person is going to believe that a 100 unit or more building, that you're just going to have 100 people in there. There's going to be multiple people living in each unit because of the cost. So you could have 200 to 400 cars, and there's nowhere for these people to park. So maybe it's an opportunity for the council to update the parking fines, and we get a robust parking and ticketing plan so that we can make some money off this if we have to. And then my last thought is maybe just a thought for the council to take some bold action, and maybe we should become a sanctuary city for SB 35, 9, and 10 and see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Dave Dornless.
Good late afternoon. I'm going to echo Paul's concerns about the definitions of transit corridors. For instance, would that include Route 141, Route 140 that weaves throughout the city, particularly like the Genevan corridor, it goes through Shelter Creek towards the park. You start going a half a mile both sides of that, and you cover most of the city. You also cover most of the area in the avenues. And if you talk about the routes that go along 380, that would pretty much cover a lot of area too. My second question that I'd like to have answered is, which and to what extent would these new laws affect development at the Crestmore site? And I think that's really all I need to say. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
Next is Malcolm Robinson. One moment, I'm trying to get Mr. Robinson unmuted.
I think I've unmuted.
There you go.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Dave. That was my first question. In looking at the pictures of the in-law units that you show, houses 2 units side by side in a given lot that now has one house. You ever been in one of those shotgun houses in New Orleans? You know that's interesting living when you're going room to room as you go through a house, as opposed to having a separate hallway to go around rooms. There's really not much privacy in those units. So what about one on top of the other? So in my neighborhood, I live in Portola Highlands. When these houses were built in '65, they were plumbed for a full bath downstairs. And a lot of my neighbors have in-law units, is what we call them, basically an apartment downstairs. It's separate from the house. Is that included in these state regulations, or is it just a totally separate unit? And the third question I had was around parking. You know, CCAG, when they look at doling out funds for things like bicycle and pedestrian improvements, they look at how many cars per house you have. My next door neighbor, he's got 7 cars now. He's down from the 11 he used to have. Well, there appears to be no limit on the number of cars a person can have. Several of my neighbors, I should say, are limo drivers. So they have multiple cars by necessity. It's the family business. They're driving limos, so they have many cars. So is there anything in this or in the works in this city council to limit the number of cars you can have or legally park on the streets in San Bruno? And I'll take my answers offline. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Nancy Foreman.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Okay, my questions have to do around infrastructure, and I'm not sure, are police and fire considered part of infrastructure or students? And then my second question would be, is SB 35 intention is to streamline the permit process. Who and how do you take into account increased students or the need for increased police or fire, and who pays for that? And that's my questions.
Thank you for your questions. The last call for anybody else from the audience wishing to speak. Okay, well, I have 2 persons, and actually the person who just came back was on there before, and then the last one will be Mike, will be our last speaker for tonight. City Clerk, if you can assist.
The first is Rachel. Rachel, whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. I am a resident on Hensley Avenue, which is directly behind this unit. We already have a lot of parking problems on our street where we are ticketed for parking our own car in our driveway because our driveway is unfortunately not large enough for a standard car. So we are very concerned about these additional hundreds of cars that are going to be right in front of our house, and want to know what is going to be done for our street. It's a very narrow street. Potentially maybe a one-way, it possibly closing one of the sidewalks to allow residents to park in their own driveway. Yeah, thank you. Please consider.
Thank you for your comments, Rachel. And our last speaker, please.
Last speaker is Mike Dunham.
Council, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I was excited to hear about this project, actually. I think one of the big problems we have in California, and one of the big drivers of the housing crisis, is that it's actually really difficult to build housing even when it's sort of compliant with existing zoning and all the rules that cities have previously established. And I think what we're seeing with the state legislature in terms of trying to address the housing crisis is looking for more and more opportunities to streamline that and give more predictability to developers. And, you know, to be totally honest, San Bruno doesn't have a great reputation when it comes to evaluating projects quickly. I think Mills Park was one example of a project that really dragged on a very long time and required a sort of threat of SB 35 to finally get an approval. And I think it's not surprising that more developers, when they look at, do I want to go through a discretionary process versus a ministerial one, choose the ministerial one. And I think that's something, you know, if you all want more, I think, input on incoming projects, you should think about, like, what can you offer developers to make it worth it to go through sort of a negotiation with the city. You know, what kind of zoning can you give them that's discretionary? Maybe you give them a bigger boost in zoning or other concessions that would make it, you know, appealing for developers to roll the dice and go through a discretionary process. The other thing I would encourage you all to do, because I think parking comes up pretty consistently in San Bruno as an issue that folks are concerned about, is parking permits, residential parking permits. I think if you look at the research by Donald Shoup, the sort of famous professor out of UCLA and their planning school, one of the big problems is that parking is free in most places. And like any good that you give away for free, it ends up being overused. And I think you're definitely in that situation where everyone wants to park on the street. You know, one of the earlier commenters talked about you know, business owners who park 3 or 4 vehicles on the street as part of their business. They should pay for that. Everyone should pay for that. And I think if you started charging a modest fee for each car that gets parked on San Bruno streets, you would see people sell their old cars, maybe clear out the garage and park in the garage, maybe park in their driveway when they don't actually need to park on the street. And a lot of these problems would go away. So I'd encourage you all to think about that in parallel to decisions like this, where maybe you don't have total flexibility on how the developer proposes their project, but you do have flexibility on how you manage parking in the city. And I think it'd be a really progressive move that other cities would copy if you did something major in that area. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, and thank you for everybody's participation and keeping it to the time limit and to the point of your question. I appreciate it. I wanted to address, because by listening to some of the callers, the transit is a little confusing. The question was more specific as Samtrans. So when people visualize that, they're thinking everywhere throughout our community, that would equate to a half a mile. So if we could just quantify that a little bit, very clear as to what that means on the transportation element again, please.
Thank you, Mayor Medina. So the request is to clarify transit rich and the application of each of these laws with regard to transit. Unfortunately, that is something we cannot do on the fly, and it's not a very easy statement to make because each of the laws use a slightly different definition, right? In state density bonus, it's a major transit stop that has a stop 8 times per day. In another law, it's transit with 15-minute headways. And so in order to provide clarity, what would need to be done is an analysis for each of the laws based on the definition of transit within that law, and then a map be drawn. And I understand that there's been a request for that, and staff will take that back. I totally understand the clarity that's being asked for in a very simple elevator speech statement. Unfortunately, based on how the transit is defined in the various laws, it's not that simple, and we don't want to do that on the fly and have someone walk away with the definition that and then say, oh, it doesn't apply to where I live when it actually may for another law. So let us go back and we'll do the work that's asked for and provide that clarity.
No, I think that's fair. So it's correct, but I could see folks saying, okay, we said El Camino, we're saying San Bruno Avenue, but now Mr. Robinson, who says, okay, I'm up here and the bus goes by, does that count? As an example, you have it clear. One of the questions was also in regards to can these laws, or would these laws potentially affect development at Crestmore High? Why don't we also put in Ingval school site, since that's a potential for development as well? Can there be any answer to that possibly?
So the state law applies everywhere in San Bruno. That's the easiest answer. Whether a individual developer or property owner seeks to take advantage and utilize the state law to potentially develop more housing or housing with less parking is a question that we're not able to answer right now. But the easy answer is yes, the state law applies to every parcel in San Bruno.
Another thing which we kind of talked about, the infrastructure, and I think you kind of answered that, you folks did in your presentation, but I think it goes down to more about once you expand in housing, then you do increase potential services and needs in our public safety or education. And so how is that attributed, or is that worked in any way with these laws?
So similar to any development, not just developments that seek to utilize the state laws that we're talking about. Development impact fees and when we talk about infrastructure paid for with development impact fees, that absolutely includes our public safety infrastructure, the buildings, the underground infrastructure that public safety uses. However, with regard to the operating costs for public safety, police and fire in particular, there is not a requirement that the developments either pay a additional fee ongoing to support police and fire based on the number of units that they're creating, nor is there a requirement in state law that the new property tax that may be generated, or sales tax, if it's a commercial property that would generate sales tax, there's not a requirement that that new revenue have some nexus to the public safety need that's created by the building. And so while yes, with development, there often comes additional ongoing revenue because there's a resetting of the property tax and the investment over what's there now, the assessed value is a lot higher. To say that there's a rational relationship that we can draw between that amount and the added public safety or requirement is just not true. And so that is not required in state law.
Thank you. And I know in summary, obviously under SB 10, council has some latitude if we chose. However, other than that, we have very little latitude. I mean, the last time was not this council, but prior, the ADUs, when it came up, staff, I'm going off memory, wanted, I think it was a maximum up to 640 square feet is what you could have. And council took an action to have it less than that, which was within our ability to do, so that it wasn't as much on the property, because again, we are concerned about parking. You heard from Rachel on Hensley, who, yes, that it is congested. Yes, that is the concern and worry. Mike asked about a parking permit. There is a parking permit program that neighborhoods can opt into. It's going to be reviewed again because it is a challenge. And what the challenge usually comes in is when you have to ration what a home can have on the street. And then some folks say, well, no, I have too many cars. So we have a quandary here. But as far as this, really, again, and staff, please correct, SB 10 gives us a little bit of latitude. But as we've known with the SB 35 and others, we've seen these laws and trying to come out and 50 and all of those. So those are not new to this council or to what it is. The unfortunate thing is we're not, many communities are not meeting the RETA numbers, not just San Bruno. And so therefore Sacramento, in their wisdom, has said, okay, well, we'll make it happen then. And that's where we're at today. And I think, staff, that's why you were trying to update us and the community specifically, especially with the potential SB 35 project. Staff, is there anything you'd like to add or opine on?
Just two things, Mr. Mayor. One is a clarification. When I said before that the new state laws apply to every parcel in San Bruno, it's every parcel that's zoned residential. Now, we can actually rezone any parcel to be residential. That doesn't say that we have to, but it does. The new laws apply to residential parcels. But it's important to know that a parcel today that's not zoned residential can be rezoned residential through a discretionary action of the city council, should that be the case later on in the future. There was another public comment with regard to off-street parking and driveways not being long enough. I do think it's important to note that, I guess pre-COVID-19, about 2 years ago, the city council did pass new regulations that actually streamlined and allowed residents to make changes on their private parcel to extend the length of their driveway, either actually insetting their garage, making the garage smaller so that parking space out in front can actually fit a car that's the size of today's cars, or regulations that allow, or if you have the space, to create additional off-street parking or actually enlarge a garage. So we absolutely know that the current built environment in portions of our community is very challenging given the number of cars that are owned. And I just wanted to point out for the resident that please feel free to contact the city's Community and Economic Development Department, because the city council has passed regulations that help if you're making changes to your private property so that you're not blocking the ADA sidewalk path.
Thank you, City Manager, for pointing those items out. Thank you. Was there any other questions from colleagues at this time? I'm sure there will be again, but I just mean while we're here together. Is there anything else, staff?
No, thank you.
Okay. Then I want to thank those who participated this evening, and whether you spoke or not, but just for being here, thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for making the time, and thank you to staff for your presentation and being available. And appreciate, I know out of this meeting has now some other items to be looking at as well. So. City Hall?
Yes, Mayor, when you're ready, we will go to item 4B.
So we're going to go now to item 4B, which is more specific to, that was the overall, which is receive a report regarding the SB 35 and density bonus development proposal on 732, 740 El Camino Real. And at this time, we're going to have our Director of Community Development, Pamela Wu, but of course, City Manager, if you had any intro.
No introduction. While this is not a meeting on the project, it is a presentation on the project. So if any council member has a conflict, it's important to recognize that now, and then we will proceed.
And again, this is an informational item. There is no action at all. It's just to update from proposed application or what have you. And staff can always, or city attorney can chime in.
Right. And through the chair, and because I do live close to the project, I would seek advice from our city attorney on whether or not the content of this presentation would require me to recuse myself or not.
City attorney?
Yes, Councilmember Salazar, thank you for asking. And even though, as the city manager indicated, this is not a meeting about the project, it's just an informational session, there may be questions and answers and so on, which would result in your participation in the item. And so I do recommend that you recuse yourself to avoid the appearance of any conflict of interest.
All right. Well, thank you for that advice, and I will take your advice then and recuse myself from this item, and I will leave the meeting.
And council member, I don't know if there's because after this we will be adjourning, so I don't know if there's a need to. Certainly, you can do what you wish, but
yeah,
I mean,
I'll log back in as a participant and watch.
Good enough. Thank you. All right. With that said, then we're going to turn it over to Director Wu.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. And thank you for your patience. So this is the second item for tonight's meeting. We'll be focusing our energy on the application that has been submitted for a SB 35 and a density bonus project. Tonight's agenda will start with the background and then go into the project summary and also talks about the entitlement process, what are the next steps for the city to take, and of course conclude my presentation with questions from council. Background, as city manager mentioned, tonight's meeting is really to inform the city council and the members of public regarding a project that has been proposed at the location of 730 to 742 El Camino. And if the project is found to be SB 35 eligible, the review and decision regarding this project will occur at a staff level, ministerial, without any discretionary approval. At this point, staff has not completed all of the initial review, and this meeting is not intended to solicit any direction, feedback, comments from council or members of public regarding the design. As the state law does not require any discretionary review per SB 35, the purpose again is to inform and to provide an overview of what has been submitted. So the project, as if it's found to be SB 35 compliant, there is a state mandated review timeline within 60 to 90 days where a consistency determination letter has to be provided within 60 days from the time it was submitted, which is November 22, 2021. If the project is found to be compliant, then the approval or denial of that project has to be issued by December 22, 2021. It's worth noting that we're focusing our energy on SB 35, but this is really a combination of SB 35 and the density bonus project, and I'll go into detail as what are the concessions and waiver that developer has proposed. Start with the location. This image, everyone is quite familiar with it. So San Bruno is to the project location, to the north of the project location, where downtown Caltrain Station is to the east, City Hall is to the south, and Mills Park Plaza is to the direct west of the project location. It is a vacant lot, approximately 0.612 acre to the south of the former Toyota building site, completely taking up the parking lot of the former Toyota dealership site on El Camino. It also abuts El Camino to the west, Hensley on the right, and also it does not border San Bruno and does not border Kane, but it's completely within the parking lot to the south of the Toyota site. Project summary, the proposed building height will be 77 feet and 9 inches. There will be a total of 6 stories. Total building sizes, no basement, but with a podium ground level parking will be approximately 120,900 square feet. The total density as proposed will be 226.7 units per acre. The development floor area, FAR, is stated as 2.3 by the developer. There will be a total of 136 units with 126 studios and 10 one-bedroom units. As this project is within a half a mile to a public transit, it does qualify for a no parking requirement as part of the SB 35 legislation. However, the developer has proposed a total of 25 parking spaces to be on the ground level, including 2 electrical vehicle reserved stalls. There will also be 140 long-term parking storage room located on the ground level, and in addition to 14 additional short-term bike racks provided on site. As I mentioned, the project is going to be 6-story, total 136 units, mostly through floor 2 through 6. The affordability for the development is shown in the table towards the bottom of the slide. Out of the 136 units, there will be 8 very low units, 59 low units, 6 moderate units, and 61 market rate. That brings the total affordability for the project at 54.5%. This is a site plan is submitted by the developer, shows the layout at the ground level. This will be the first level. There will be a leasing office to the left of the building, a mail room, a utility room, trash enclosure, bicycle storage room, in addition to 25 parking spaces. The main access will be taken from El Camino and out of El Camino, where the building is set back approximately 18 feet from El Camino and about the closest about 2 feet from Hensley in the back. As I mentioned earlier, floor 2 through 6 will be comprised of residential units for a total of 136. This floor plan shows the exact same layout for level 3 through 6, with the difference on level 2, where you see the middle of the S1, 4 of the S1 studio units will be converted into a fitness amenity room on level 2. As I mentioned, this is a SB 35 in addition to the density bonus project. Even though the project's located in the city's transit corridor plan, the TCP, where there's no maximum density imposed with any project, the deeper affordability of 54.5 qualifies the developer to request density bonus incentive and concession. As such, the developer proposed to utilize 2 concessions, the first being height exceeding the current height allowance and also number of stories, and the second concession on the step backs. As the TCP states that the current zoning regulation allows only 75 feet as the maximum, where the developer asked for 77 feet and 9 inches, 5-story, where the developer proposed to have a 6-story building. And also, as it's been codified in the TCP and also Transit Corridor Zoning District, where there should be a 15 feet step back requirement for floors 4 through 6 on Hensley and El Camino side of the building. The developer proposed to use another concession to waive the step back requirement. In addition to the 2 concessions, these relate to financial feasibility of the project. The developer also reserved their right to request a future waiver should the project becomes physical impossible, and that waiver will be coming at a later time. The entitlement process for this project, should the project is found to be SB 35 eligible, it will be reviewed by staff ministerially without any discretionary approval. That means no planning commission, no architectural review committee or city council to be compliance with the state law. State law also mandates 60-day review period to take place from the time the submittal is received, and also a 90-day approval or denial letter from the time the application is received. As I mentioned, the project is also currently being reviewed for the architectural review permit, again, staff level review, in addition to the density bonus concession request review by staff, and also a lot merger review to combine the underlying lots into one. If the project is found to be SB 35 compliant, the project is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, per section Government Code 65913.4, as well as the CEQA Guideline 15628. After the entitlement is processed, should the project wants to continue, they will be subject to the same building permit review as any other project. This brings to the conclusion of my presentation. More than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Any questions, colleagues? Put your virtual hand up this time. Councilmember Mason.
Yeah, I think because this is an educational meeting, is there by any chance any a breakdown of the salary or the income requirements for the various affordable housing units?
Councilmember Mason, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, is there a breakdown of the affordability, either by income or salary requirements to qualify for any of the very low, moderate, or market rate units?
There's a slide on the affordability. So for the very low, it's usually 50% of the average median income for the county, the AMI. Low is at 80%, moderate is at 110%. Market rate has no restriction. I have not looked up the current AMI for the county, but we can definitely provide that number for you.
Okay, yeah, if we could get the actual numbers, because I think the percentiles can be a little confusing for people. So what, I know a while ago, very low was like 60,000, and I think that was about 4 years ago. So I'm curious to know what it is now. I just wanted to say I am very excited to see very low income in this project. I think it's desperately needed here. So I am happy to see the very low income, the low income, and then obviously moderate and market rate you see a lot more of. I did want to ask how, if you're aware of how the developer or management, how do they select who gets those units?
Councilmember Mason, those conversations have not yet occurred. We received the application late in September, and we are processing the entitlement application. Those discussions typically happen toward the latter part of the entitlement cycle, but really into building permit issuance. And so we will be having those discussions. But it is important to note that our ability to regulate that may be limited as well.
Okay, and well, it's understandable based on the presentation we just received that our ability to regulate this is incredibly limited as well. I think in this case, maybe more so than staff. My next question is really about the neighborhood. So we heard a caller earlier that lived on Hensley that was concerned about the parking. Not surprisingly, and I'm just curious if this project moves forward, would the residents still receive notifications of different points in the process, just so that they're aware of what's happening? Could they come to City Hall and express their concerns? What is the process for communicating with the residents within the community?
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Councilwoman Mason. The city is making a commitment by this presentation, which is not a required presentation, and through the mailers that we sent to inform the community. That's something that we wanted to do first and foremost after receiving the application, is to have a format like this where we provide clear and transparent information to the community. Part of your question alludes to the community being notified. I would almost say as a typical project goes through the discretionary public meetings. State law does not allow for those discretionary meetings and those more routine notifications. The city, however, will make a commitment to keeping the community informed about this project. It was in the city manager's newsletter that was emailed out last week. We will also continue to utilize our social media resources as well as other communication vehicles, just to make sure that the community is informed about the project. We know and recognize as soon as we received the application, we knew that this would be a very important project and one garnering significant attention. And so we will continue to ensure that the community is informed, and there's a place for a member of the public to go and to get information on what stage of the state mandated approval process of the project is in.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, and I think that as far as the last reports we had heard, YouTube had been looking at bringing in about 500 additional employees a year for quite a few years. That doesn't include the new Amazon that's being built. That doesn't include the biotech hub that's being built across from very close to the San Bruno Airport. So I think this, helps our RENA requirements. I do really wish that the developer is more thoughtful around parking, because parking is still an issue, as we've heard over and over again.
I'm sorry. I'm going to pause just for a moment. I apologize, council member. I just don't know, staff, should we be going into these specifics at this moment, or is this, I know it's informational at a high level, but I just want to make sure we're not, if each of us are giving feedback and commentary or something, is that okay on the project?
Through the mayor, I think with tonight, we absolutely envision comments and questions from the city council. In Director Wu's presentation, I think she used the term that this is not a discretionary meeting where we're seeking direction from the city council, because that's not prescribed for and allowed in state law to have that type of discretionary hearing where council is providing direction. This project has to go through a legally prescribed ministerial process. And so general comments from the city council, we did absolutely envision and I think are appropriate to hear tonight.
Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me the pause, council member. Please continue.
No worries. No, I was just saying that I think we do need the housing. We have not met our RENA requirements. I want to just reiterate the excitement around the very low and the low income units, where I think there's a great need in our community. And I do hope that there's some thought put into the minimum parking, because I do think that the impact is greater on the community surrounding than the community that's living in the units. And as we see our city grow and more employers come in, the units are going to be needed. So I think as far as just my comments, that's about it. And then just to congratulate Director Wu for taking on yet another project with your, I know these projects are exciting, but I know you're really limited with your staff. So hopefully if you need anything from the council, you'll let us know. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Hamilton.
So in the interest of not repeating, I have the same, I'm pleased for the same things and concerned for the same things that were already articulated. Specifically pleased, especially for the very low and low income housing that we'll be able to provide with this. But also, concerned about the parking. One question that I had about the parking that I noticed when reading through the packet, and then the slide in question actually, the diagram in question actually made it into the presentation, slide number 7. All the talk about the parking is about 25 spaces, but then in the presentation it says plus or minus 25 spaces, and I'm just wondering how much of a minus would it be? I don't think they can plus anymore into this design, but I have never seen that before in plans, and I'm just wondering if I'm reading that correctly, and if I am, are they allowed to do that, since the minus could be 0 and they would still meet the requirement?
Sure, Councilmember Hamilton. So the 25 plus and minus is including the 2 EV. So it's really 23 regular plus 2 EV charging station, in addition to necessary ADA parking that they would have to also figure it out.
Okay, so that number isn't going to vary. Okay. I was reading the plus or minus as whatever we end up with, but it is still planned.
Keep in mind that they are not required to provide any parking.
Yes.
Yeah. So if the developer decides to come back and reduce the 25, we don't have a way to react to that.
Understood. Okay, thank you. And thank you for the presentations. This one and the one before. I don't think I said thank you last time.
Thank you, Councilmember. Vice Mayor Medina.
Yes, thank you for this other presentation. My question is regarding what I'm looking at the agenda packet here, and so the developer reserves the right to request future waivers at a later date. What type of waivers would those be? Like, what is that? What is that? If you, whatever you can tell us about that.
Sure. So as I mentioned in the prior item, there are concessions and there are waivers. Concessions have to be something that will make the project financially feasible. Waivers are reductions that will make the project physically feasible. So for instance, the developer reserved their right to come back later on to say, I want to request a setback or step back, which is a physical feasibility to make the project happen. So at this point, they have not declared that waiver. They reserve the right to come back to use it at a later date.
And when if they were to modify that, does that reset the clock on the 60 days?
Yes, they do. So when they come back from the time of the resubmittal, we get another 60 days to reevaluate the criteria.
Got it. Thank you. And I'll just share the concern, I'm sure, of the community and this council, of those that already stated, of the impact of 136 units with 25 parking spaces. I drove on Hensley today, and today was street sweeping day, right? So you could only park on one side of the street today. There was approximately 37 spaces on one side of the street, and just what that's going to do to the community, and hoping that there is some awareness from the developer of that, understanding that. So my other question is looking at the particular location of this project where there is a proposed future signal light that requires Caltrans approval. Does Caltrans have a say on the location of the entrance to this facility, to this project, with the possibility of a signal being installed, within, I don't know, 50, 25 feet, right there on Kane?
Councilmember Mason, I'm sorry, Vice Mayor Medina, your question, Linda's always asks a question, so I'm used to responding to all the questions. I'm joking, Linda.
I take no offense at being called Councilwoman Mason. That's fine.
Vice Mayor Medina, your question with regard to a new signal for the project, or if a new signal is added for the project. I mean, I'm unclear.
Sure, no problem.
You think a new signal is needed and may be added, or?
My understanding was there was already a signal to be installed per the Mills Park project that was approved.
Yes, not connected to this project. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. We were a little unclear because there was not a signal proposed for this project.
Understood. But that would be Caltrans's call about that signal, and where the location of that entrance is pretty close. So I just was interested in hearing, how does Caltrans get involved in this decision?
So
about the entrance could be moved around later on, I suppose.
I can take it. Vice Mayor Medina, so the new entrance to the new project and in relationship to the new intersection for the Mills Park, they're all within the right-of-way of El Camino, which will fall under the jurisdiction of Caltrans. So as the project comes through, we have routed the project to Caltrans for their feedback, and we'll continue to work with them on any sort of comments that they will provide through the project review.
Okay. I think those are the primary concerns. I think it's great that we are attracting the development and the much needed housing. and how that gets balanced out remains to be seen. So thank you for the presentation.
And then just one quick question, then we'll go to members of the public. So any members of the public that wish to speak on this item, if you could start to raise your virtual hand, and then we'll go right to you. As far as outreach, we know what our requirements are, notification, postcards that were, like you said, the postcards that were mailed out and this informational aspect were done on the city, and it's not a normal or required process, but was done to inform and educate the community. But as far as for the developer, even though we have limited opportunities to make changes and modifications, I would hope and have an expectation that the developer would still be reaching out to the community, embracing out, speaking to them, just like if it was any other project, that folks were brought in and asked, talked to. Doesn't mean they're going to hear everything they want to hear, but I think they have a right to be heard. And so I know that that's not in the laws. I get that, SB 35, but I'm hoping that somehow that we require that of them, because everybody wants to be a good neighbor in the end, and I think that's the first. Let's go to the members of the public. I have one person from the public at this time. And if the city clerk can bring two folks, and if we could bring the first person in, please.
Yes, the first is Paul Wapensky.
Good evening again. Can you hear me?
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Thanks. The city manager spoke about, the director spoke about the waiver for environmental stuff. That's been a parking lot for a while with the used cars and stuff in there. Are they required to clean up any oil or gas that's leaked into that area and have it checked before, or is that waiver cover all that? My second thing is, and it's just popped in my head, is it possible that this project and the Mills Park project could happen at the same time and creating a real traffic nightmare on El Camino? My third thing is, and Councilmember Mason brought this up, but I've got some amplifying question on it, is who determines what the income levels are, or whatever they are? What's the oversight? Does the city do that to make sure that these people are actually eligible to live in those units, so people aren't taking advantage of them? And then my last thing is, since this is going to be a 6-story building, does our fire department have a fire truck that can reach the top of that? And if not, who pays for a new fire truck? Does the city pick up that tab, or because it sounds like we're going to end up having to pay for something that we didn't plan for? And fire truck, I think the last one we bought was $750,000 with a couple-year lead time. So I hope someone's looking at that, because I don't know if we have that capability right now to support that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. We have our final speaker, please.
Mike Dunham.
Good evening, Council. Thank you for indulging me again. My name is Mike Dunham. I'm a lead with Peninsula for Everyone, and wanted to offer just a few more thoughts on this particular project. I went on Google Maps and just mapped the walking distance from here to the San Bruno Caltrain station. It's 6 minutes. That's incredible. I think you will see a lot of the concerns about parking that I think you all articulated, and I'm sure all of the folks who live around there also feel. I think once this project's a reality, I think it's not going to be that big a deal. Because I think a lot of folks, especially folks who need affordable housing, don't want the expense of a car and a car payment and insurance and gas. If they can spend, $150 a month on a Caltrain pass, that's huge, and they can get to work and save themselves a ton of money. So I think the location of this project is really going to bear out why state law reduces or eliminates parking requirements in these situations. I also looked up, thank you, Mayor Medina, earlier for pointing out that you all do have a voluntary residential parking permit program. It seems, relatively straightforward for a resident to file one of these petitions. I wonder how much there's, if you all are worried about parking, rather than asking the developer to do anything, and I know you can't officially ask, is the city should better publicize the fact that this program exists, maybe hold a workshop with folks in that neighborhood who are worried about parking, and walk them through how they might petition to make the area a residential parking permit area. In fact, given how close the Caltrain it is, it wouldn't surprise me if you actually have a lot of like Caltrain riders who park in that neighborhood all day long and don't actually live there, and they're just trying to save a few bucks by not parking at Caltrain. And so I think it could be a sort of a double dip to get that neighborhood into the RPPP program. And I think I'd really encourage the city to invest some resources in educating residents about it and making it as easy as possible for them to apply. And I think that would go a long way towards making those folks' lives better and reducing this annoyance. If the developer is listening, I encourage you keep the parking as it is, and the city should really go after residential parking permits. That's the real long-term answer in that neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Okay, we'll bring it back to staff. There were a couple questions, and maybe one is on the fire department. You know, do we have current, once this is, if and when this is developed, do we have the truck that can reach that, et cetera? That was one. The income level oversight, I'm going to say that is up to the facility there, as we have the villa that has that type of housing element as well. And to my knowledge, they are the ones who facilitate it, oversee it, take the waiting list. Another question was the EIR cleanup, as well as could it be a possibility that both projects from each other across the street could be similar in their development?
Sure. Mayor Medina, in response to your recap of the questions from residents, yes, there still needs to be any environmental cleanup, and the CEQA California Environmental Quality Act waiver does not waive the responsibility of the developer to clean up any environmental issues. With regard to parking permits, it is absolutely true that the city does have a voluntary residential parking permit program. Unfortunately, state law has thought about that as well. And so SB 35 says that if a on-street parking program is in effect and permits are not provided to the property, the property does not have to provide any parking. And so our ability, whether the program is voluntary or implemented by the city, to exclude new residents of this building from a residential parking program is clear in SB 35 and is preempted. And so we know that through this application, we will continue to research every avenue to protect the community and to ensure that should this project be approved, that there are every tool at our disposal to ensure that the community is protected. We will employ, but our ability to implement a residential parking program and exclude residents of this new building is limited and likely preempted, but we will continue to look into that. With regard to fire, can our current ladder truck reach a 6-story building? The answer to that is yes. The answer to the other part of that question, which is ensuring that new development pays for the additional operating costs for police and fire. I think we answered that before, that there's not a required nexus, but new development does come with increased ongoing revenues such as property tax. With regard to administration or confirmation that this property or any other property is complying with the AMI regulations and the income verification, we currently contract that out to the county. There is an option for the city to take that on internally. but just know that there is a process for income verification. We do have the AMI and can provide that statistics, but it's important to note that the AMI will change once, in a couple years, should this project be built. And so while we can cite a number today of what 50% of AMI is, know that that number will change.
And I think the final one was just, could we see both projects going on at the same time? But I can just say that's looking into a crystal ball, in the sense some folks thought Allen and Mills would be going simultaneously. Well, that's obviously didn't occur. Let's go back around to my colleagues for one last time and finish up. Councilmember Mason.
I just wanted to address Mr. Dunham, because I think we all hear you. The parking permit program, maybe just for some context, if staff could just let us know how many neighborhoods have signed up for the parking program as of today.
So the voluntary residential parking permit program, we have had no neighborhood step forward through the process to voluntarily elect to implement a residential parking program, which by its very nature would restrict the number of vehicles each residential unit can park on the street. And so we've had no neighborhood step forward through the process to avail themselves of that program.
Right. And so, I just want to point this out, because I think that oftentimes councils get criticized for making parking an excuse. But living in San Bruno, I can honestly say that it is the biggest complaint we get, especially from the east side. And so it really is a very real concern. And I think that as we move forward and the character changes, part of our responsibility is to bring our community with us, and we have to respect the community that is there and the concerns that are around that area. And so I think that the parking, if it's possible to even add things like Zipcar, the car share services, what I'm a little bit concerned about is that you're 6 minutes from the Caltrain station, which is amazing, but you might have a car and then still walk to BART or Caltrain to get to work. And so those are just things that we are likely going to have to deal with as more development comes. And I think that's understandable. But as much as possible, if we can plan ahead and try to mitigate and minimize the inconvenience, that would be great, while also housing more people. One of the other questions I wanted to ask about was just under the new laws. I know the answer, but I just want to make sure to ask it, is around the height limits. I know that with Mills Park, one of the issues around the height limits was kind of mitigated by the idea that there's a little bit of leveling off as you go up the hill on San Bruno Avenue. And in this case, I believe it's going to be directly across the street from the single family homes. And so so that everybody's clear on the project, is there anything that can be done around the height limits?
So, Councilwoman Mason, just to clarify, your question is there any action that the city council or the community can take with regard to, one, the height for this project, or two, in general, height limits? The answer to that for the project is the project seeks to use state density bonus law, which if they're successful in utilizing that tool, that will allow an additional story, so from 5 stories to 6 stories. The answer sort of citywide is there the possibility to what's called in the industry down zone and lower the heights. That has also been preempted by state law. And so the tools in the tool bag to design and curate the fabric of the community through our local land use regulations have in many ways been restricted by a lot of these new state laws. And those are the ones that we talked about earlier. Senate Bill 9, Senate Bill 10, Senate Bill 330, Senate Bill 35, SB 35, as well as state density bonus law. It's also worth noting that the city council has been active when new state legislation is proposed, and I'm reminded of the letter that this community wrote for Senate Bill 50, which was one that didn't pass, and we made, you made that point at that time, saying that the new proposed state legislation may very well result in more housing being built, but the tools that were being taken away from local municipalities like San Bruno will negatively impact our ability to protect the fabric of the community and have new development designed in a way where there are not negative consequences like the parking challenges that we've been talking about tonight. So it is unfortunately a reality of the housing crisis and the new state laws that limit your authority and the authority of even the voters of the city of San Bruno.
Thank you. And then I am excited to see the numerous bike stations. So I just want to remind everyone that the vision statement of San Bruno is a place to live, learn, work, shop, and play. And so that does encourage the idea of having all of them. And with all the companies we have coming in, it may actually be possible to do everything within San Bruno. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on Mayor Medina's comment around the developer communication. I recall that with one of our previous projects, we had a commitment from the developer to actually communicate with the community and to have a point of contact as the development moves forward, just for ease, and so that the community had somebody that they could reach out to if there were any issues that were raised. And I would imagine that's definitely not required, but I am asking if the staff has had any communication with the developer and and the willingness to work with the community as this project moves forward.
So we have had significant conversations with the developer. What we have heard is the developer desires for the city to process their application in accordance with Senate Bill 35 and state density bonus. We will certainly convey the sentiment that has been expressed by the city council today, that there be a process and outreach on the developer to reach out to the community. And I'll interpret that for both phases, the entitlement phase as well as building phase. And during the potential construction, should the project be approved.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for bringing this before us tonight.
Last call, council. Not seeing any hands. Then staff, is there, city manager, anything we want to conclude on before I adjourn?
No, just want to thank the city council, thanks to members of the public. We really wanted to have this meeting solely to provide information and the information that we have.
Thank you. And again, thanks everyone for your time and your presentations and taking the questions. And again, we concluded within our time period, so I appreciate everyone. And so therefore, we're going to adjourn to the next regular city council meeting, which will be held on Tuesday, October the 26th, 2021 at 7 p.m. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your evening.